Rabbinic Judaism is the mainstream form of Judaism that has defined the religion since the 6th century CE. Emerging from the Pharisees of the Second Temple period, it shifted Jewish practice from a temple-centric sacrificial system to one centered on the study of scripture, prayer, and daily adherence to religious law, halakha. Core beliefs. The dual Torah. The central premise of Rabbinic Judaism is that at Mount Sinai, God gave Moses both the written Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and the oral Torah, a vast body of interpretations, laws, and traditions initially passed down verbally. Divine authority of the sages. The rabbis assert they are the legitimate transmitters of the oral law, possessing the authority to interpret God's will, apply biblical principles to modern circumstances, and establish practices, such as building a fence around the Torah to prevent the transgression of laws. Key texts. To preserve the oral Torah from being lost in the wake of the destruction of the Second Temple, 70 CE, the sages began recording their legal and interpretative debates. The Mishnah, compiled around 200 CE, this is the foundational written compendium of Jewish oral law. The Talmud, composed of the Mishnah and the subsequent Gemara, an extensive elucidation and commentary. This massive collection of 63 tractates is the ultimate guide to Jewish law, ethics, and theology. Midrash, a collection of rabbinic homilies, biblical exegesis, and narrative interpretations that expand on the text of the Hebrew Bible. Practices and influence. Historically, Rabbinic Judaism relocated the focus of holiness from the Jerusalem temple to the local synagogue, the study hall, yeshiva, and the Jewish home. It guides nearly every aspect of life, from dietary laws, kashrut, and daily prayer, siddur, to civil law and family ethics. Nearly all modern branches of Judaism, including Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, are descendants of Rabbinic Judaism. While they interpret the authority and application of rabbinic law differently, all share its foundational calendar, liturgy, and interpretive framework. For a deeper dive into the theological underpinnings, you can explore the Britannica article on Rabbinic Judaism or read about the origins in the My Jewish Learning Guide to the Oral Torah. 1948 ERS are converts. Some might be Israelites. They deviate heavily from written laws, statutes, and commandments, that they refer to as the Torah, instructions. Example, they claim descendancy through the mother, when the law establishes pedigree by the house of the Israelites' father, Numbers 1:17-18. They are not under the Lord's curses, which are perpetual sign of the true descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Israel, Deuteronomy 28:45-46. They, as Gentiles themselves, have systematically gained control of a land that is not theirs, Joel 3:1-2, Ezekiel 35. By authority of their Gentile cousins and not by the prophecy of Israel's captivity being returned by and with the Anointed himself to never war again nor be under the subjection of the Gentiles any longer. Not only have they gained control a land that is not theirs, they have also managed to gain control over financial systems, all forms of media, and even employ a majority their own people as actors and actresses in the creation known as Hollywood, a type of wood used in pagan European magic folklore. These are antithetical to the scriptures. They have also managed in influence, to their own benefit and advantage, the political governments of their European Gentile cousins throughout the world. These methods are by the confederacies of the Gentile men, not by the providence of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Israel, and their seed, descendants, after them. The 1948 ERS witnesses against themselves. Author Kessler wrote a book entitled, The 13th Tribe. In it, Kessler postulates that in order for the 1948 ERS to be Israelites, there would have to be a 13th tribe, of which the Holy Bible does not support. The first edition of his book is priced at $512.01. Later editions may have been edited, but this first edition is the one that started his fellow 1948 ERS attacking him, culminating in his untimely deletion under suspicious circumstances, both he and his wife. An excerpt from the book makes a point, in the section, The 13th Tribe, Race and Myth. In addition to these aforementioned, social heredity, through childhood conditioning, acted as a powerful formative and deformative factor. Each of these processes contributed to the emergence of the ghetto type. In the post-ghetto period it became progressively diluted. As for the genetic composition and physical appearance of the pre-ghetto stock, we know next to nothing. In the view presented in this book, this original stock was predominantly Turkish mixed to an unknown extent with ancient Palestinian and other elements. Nor is it possible to tell which of the so-called typical features, such as the Jewish nose, is a product of sexual selection in the ghetto, or the manifestation of a particularly persistent tribal gene. Since nostrility is frequent among Caucasian peoples, and infrequent among the Semitic Bedouins, we have one more pointer to the dominant role played by the 13th tribe in the biological history of the Jews. And there is yet another 1948 ER, Shlomo Sands, that wrote his book, entitled, The Invention of the Jewish People, quote, extravagantly denounced and praised according to the New York Times. In the book, Shlomo Sand argues that most Jews actually descend from converts, whose native lands were scattered far across the Middle East and Eastern Europe. The formation of a Jewish people and then a Jewish nation out of these disparate groups could only take place under the sway of a new historiography, developing in response to the rise of nationalism throughout Europe. Beneath the biblical backfill of the 19th century historians, and the 20th century intellectuals who replaced rabbis as the architects of Jewish identity, the invention of the Jewish people uncovers a new narrative of Israel's formation, and proposes a bold analysis of nationalism that accounts for the old myths. Now, let us get to the definition of two suffixes. The first suffix is the ISM suffix, in the Cambridge University's dictionary. The first definition means a set of beliefs, especially ones that you disapprove of. The secondary definition is, quote, used to form nouns that refer to social, political, or religious beliefs, studies, or ways of behaving. The second suffix of discussion is the suffix ish. The first definition is, quote, used for saying that something is not completely true or exactly right. The secondary definition is, quote, used to form adjectives, that is, descriptions, and nouns, persons, places, or things, that say what country or area a person, thing, or language comes from. Such as in the examples, reading, "Are you English?" or, "Are you from England?" The third definition means, like or resembles something, quote, used to form adjectives, that is, descriptions, that say what a person, thing, or action is like. In the example, we see the words, foolish, meaning like a fool, someone who has been tricked, deceived, or cheated, and the word, childish, meaning like or behaving like a child.
Another area in Africa you have something big happening is in Nigeria. You have the Igbo people, or Igbo, pronounced either way. There's 40 million of them, also Christians, like I spoke about before, how that could happen to the children of Israel very easily. But also a lot of them are now coming out and converting back or adopting the rules of the Torah without all the paganism that they've been practicing for hundreds of years. There's been books written about it from scholars in Nigeria, from scholars from the Jewish people. And where it gets interesting is, in America, there was a slave trade. And a lot of the slaves, a very high percentage of them, came from Western Nigerian ports. And in America today, you see a very large movement of African Americans who say that they're the real chosen people, that they're the children of Israel, they're the Judeans. You know, so what are they just trying to create an identity for themselves because they were slaves, or is there really something here? And the answer is, most likely there is something there. And most likely, maybe that they were the original Israelites, and maybe that the Jewish people today who are white, Caucasian people came in a little bit later on. And most likely, maybe that they were the original Israelites, and maybe that the Jewish people today who are white, Caucasian people came in a little bit later on. We know that some of the greatest sages of the transmission of the Torah were converts from Rome. We know that some of the greatest sages of the transmission of the Torah were converts from Rome. You have a man named Onkelos who wrote a commentary on the Torah, unprecedented, that we still learn today. he was a convert. Some of the largest pillars on the transmission today were Roman converts. Some of the largest pillars on the transmission today were Roman converts. Some of the largest pillars on the transmission today were Roman converts. So here we are, we're Caucasian Jewish people, and now you have people in Africa saying that they're the real people of Israel. It can't be ruled out at all.
You know why? You know why? Because if they don't, they're kicked up. They come around and they tell you how much you must give. And if you don't, oh, you're anti-Semitic. Then some of their friends will have anything to do with them, and they start a smear campaign, and you've got to give. In New York City, in the Garment Center, there are 12 manufacturers in the building, and when the drive is on to sell Israel bomb, the United Jewish drive, they put a big straw board with the names of the firms, and opposite them, as you make the amount they put you down for, they put a gold star. And the buyers are told, when you come into that building to call on someone, and they haven't got a gold star, go up and tell them you won't buy from them until they have a gold star. Black. I don't know what else you can call it. Then what do? They tell you it's for humanitarian purposes, and they sent maybe $8 billion to Israel, tax-exempt, tax-deductible. So if they hadn't spent that $8 billion to Israel, $7 billion of it would have gone to the United States Treasury as income tax. So what happened? That $7 billion deficit, that air pocket, the some Christians have to make up. They put a bigger tax on gas or bread or corporation tax. Somebody has to pay the housekeeping expenses to the government. So why do you let these people spend their money over there to buy guns, to drive people out of their ancient homeland, and you say, oh, well, the poor Jews, they have no place to go, and they're persecuted all their life. They've never been persecuted for religion. And I wish I had 2 older rabbis who could challenge. Never once in all history have they been persecuted for their religion. You know why the Jews were driven out of England? You know they were. And that was the first, 1285, and they never came back until the Cromwell Revolution, which was financed by the Rothschilds. For 400 years there wasn't a Jew. Did you know why they were driven out of? Because the Christian faith and the Muslim faith is for sin to charge rent with use of money. In other words, what we call interest. It's a sin. So the Jews had a monopoly in England. And they charged so much interest, and when the American Jews couldn't pay, they foreclosed. And they were creating so much trouble that the King of England finally made himself their partner, because when they claimed his foreclosed, some of these Jews dumped off the money. So the king finally said, and this is all in history, look up Hamilton or Roth, the history of the Jews in England, 2 books that you find in your library, that when the king found out what this trouble was all about, he found out how much money they were making, he declared himself a 50% partner of the money makers. They were the country. And for many years, 1/3 of the revenue of the British Treasury came from the 50% interest in money lending by the Jews. But it got everything worse, so much worse, that they kept up this idea of pumping off the money lenders, and then the King of England said, well, I declare myself the heir of all the money lenders. If they're pumped off, you've got to pay me, I'm the sole heir. So that makes so much trouble, because the king had to go out and threaten with an army that he told the Jews, get the hell out of here. And they every Jew, there were 15,000 of them, they had to get out, and they went across to Ireland. And that's how Ireland That's how Irish got into the United Kingdom. When King Edward found out what they were doing, he said, well, if anybody takes that nice island over there, I'm going to take it for myself. And he sent Robert Southguard with a mercenary army and conquered Ireland. So, show me one time there is no case in all history that I know about where a Jew was persecuted in any country because he went home and put on those things that politics fill him and said, "Smiley throw ale," instead of going to a church and saying, "Our Father in heaven." Not one. It's always their impact on the political, social, or economic customs and traditions of the community in which they're set. Now, somebody back there wants.
And when you think about like this Nephilim agenda and the globalist agenda, they're really serving the same end goal, and that is total domination of humanity. I mean, it's tyranny on the grandest scale. So that's kind of an overview of the Nephilim agenda. But now kind of connecting the dots, from the Edomites to the Khazarians. So keep in mind, I talked about how the Edomites have some of these traits of the Nephilim. Well, if we follow the Edomite migration, this is where it begins to connect with Khazaria. Mm-hmm. And so during the time of the Babylonian captivity, so under King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, he took captive those living in the land of Judah or Judea. And so that happened in 586 BC, I believe it was. And so when that happened, the Edomites saw, the Israelites taken into captivity, or the people from Judah taken into captivity. And they decided, we're going to take over the land that just, where they got taken out of. And so they take up residence in Judah. Well, then several centuries later, so in the 1st century BC, now you have these two towns called Marissa and Dora. These are considered Idumean cities, but Idumea is just the Greek term for Edom. So Edom is Hebrew, Idumea is Greek. They're speaking of the same thing. So in the 1st century BC, you have this man named John Hyrcanus, and he conquered both Marissa and Dora, these two Idumean cities. Well, he was the leader of what was called the Maccabean revolt. And when he took over these cities, he gave the Idumeans an ultimatum. And he said, you either leave the land of Judea or you convert to Judaism. Well, they loved the land so much, they didn't want to leave. So they converted to Judaism. So here you have this mass conversion that's forced on them. And this is the first mass conversion in the history of Judaism. Well, obviously it's not genuine because it was forced upon them. But what happens is now you have this mixture in marriages between the Edomites and the Judeans. Well, under Roman rule, what happens is the Idumeans, so the Edomites, they began to rise in power. And they're actually given governmental oversight of the land of Judea under the line of Herod, King Herod. And there's so much mixture during this time that even famous Jewish historians like Josephus, as he's writing about this period of time, he no longer distinguishes between the Idumeans, who are the Edomites, and the Judeans, because there's so much mixture.
Yeah.
Well, then what happens is you have another migration that happens into the Caucasus region. And this is the Jews make a mass migration right before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Well, this diaspora of Jews is made up of both Edomites or Idumeans and Judeans. Again, there's been so much mixture in marriages and in families, it's hard to differentiate. Well, in some of my research, I came across a very important book written by C.F. Parker. He wrote this in 1949. And it's called A Short Study of the Esau, Edom in Jewry. And so it looks at the migration of the Idumeans and the Judeans. So I'll read an excerpt. He says, Armenian and Georgian histories record that after the destruction of the first temple, Nebuchadnezzar deported numbers of Jewish captives into Armenia and the Caucasus. Okay, so not only did Nebuchadnezzar take these captives into Babylon, but also they went into Armenia and the Caucasus. These exiles were joined later by co-religionists from Media and Judea. Jews lived in the Crimea and along the entire eastern coast of the Black Sea at the beginning of the Common Era. Jews from Crimea moved eastward and northward and became the founders of Jewish communities along the shores of the Caspian Sea, carrying with them a civilization more advanced than that of the native tribes among which they settled. The complexity of these migratory movements, showing that right up to the last days in this bitterly contested history of the nation, large numbers of Jews migrated to or were deported into regions adjacent to the gateways into Europe through the Caucasus, through which they passed in large numbers for some centuries into the Christian era. Out of any comprehensive analysis of all the ethnic data available, there is bound to come one inescapable conclusion, that just as the Idumeans became part and parcel of the Jewish nation after their amalgamation with it in the time of John Hyrcanus, so too they became an integral part in its enforced migrations towards the Caucasus and subsequently into Central Europe, whither they carried Hellenism. Okay, so let me summarize all of that. So essentially what he's talking about is the Edomites and the Jews migrated into the Caucasus region after the fall of Jerusalem and even before that. Well, this area was inhabited by the Khazars. So who were the Khazars? Well, they were a violent, warlike people from Asia who migrated north into the Caspian Sea region, and that happened in the 1st century BC. Well, they quickly amassed, the Khazarian kingdom quickly amassed nearly 1 million square miles. And that now is the area what we consider Eastern Europe. So Ukraine and even parts of Russia, which is interesting to think about because, you know, as we understand the history of this region, it begins to spread light about how this area has really been a breeding ground for Nephilim hosts for the last 2,000 years. And it actually sheds light on some of the geopolitical conflict that we've seen between Russia and Ukraine. And so it begins to show how the Khazarians have had an impact on world history. But we can go into that more, but I'll pause there because that was a lot.
Wow, no, that's fantastic. So can you just help me out then? So the Nephilim part of that was through the Edomites, is that correct? Or what was the
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Right.
Okay, so from the Nephilim, you get the Raphiam, which I didn't talk about, but that's in my book.
Yeah.
From the Raphiam, it goes to the horites, and the horites bred with the Edomites through Esau's line, and then the Edomites they blend with the Judeans, and now they make migration into the land of Khazaria. And so now we'll tap into who are the Khazarians, because we can't from just normal history books find much information out about Khazaria because it's been covered up. And so we have to look to a couple of experts, and one of them, his name is Benjamin Friedman. Now, he was a successful Jewish businessman in the United States. He was based in New York City in the early 1900s, and he was super well connected with the political leaders of that time. Well, he has a very interesting perspective, actually unparalleled in some regards, because not only does he have a perspective on Khazaria, but also modern day Jewry, because he was a Zionist operative, but he defected in 1945. And so I'll read to you some of what he talks about regarding the Khazars. He says, in the 1st century BC, the Khazars had invaded Eastern Europe from their homeland in Asia. So they were not Semites, they were an Asiatic Mongoloid nation. In a comparatively short period, the Khazars established the largest and most powerful kingdom in Europe, and probably the wealthiest also. He says, the Khazars were a pagan nation. The vile forms of sexual excess indulged in by the Khazars as their form of religious worship produced a degree of moral degeneracy that Khazar's king could not endure. So in the 7th century, King Bulan decided to abolish the practice of phallic worship and selected the future state religion as Talmudism, now known and practiced as Judaism. So here we have another forced conversion to Judaism. So just like the Idumeans, you now have this mass conversion of the Khazarians to Judaism. Now, the other expert that we can learn from, his name is Matthew Johnson, and he was a professor of both history and political science from Penn State University here in the United States and also St. Mary's University. Well, he was an expert in Russian and Ukrainian history, which actually made him well-versed in Khazaria. And so he says this, he says the Khazar theory suggests there is no connection between Israelites and Jews. Yet even if there were, the religion of the modern Jew bears no relationship whatsoever to the Israelite faith, which is vehemently condemned in the Talmud. In adopting the ethic of the Talmud, they adopted the mentality of the Pharisees, whose arrogance served as an early foundation of the Talmud. So now if we think about, okay, what is the connection of the Talmud to the Pharisees? Because here's these Khazarian Jews that were, forced into Judaism, now are studying the Babylonian Talmud. Well, there's another man named Louis Finkelstein. He was a prominent American Jew, but he also was a Talmudic scholar. And he provides the link for us from the Talmud to the Pharisees. He writes this, he says, Pharisaism became Talmudism, which became medieval rabbinism, and then medieval rabbinism became modern rabbinism. So when the Jew studies the Talmud, he is actually repeating the arguments in the Palestinian academies. So what the Khazarian Jews adhered to was really the Pharisaical teachings. That's because they followed the Babylonian Talmud. Now, the Talmud is made up of the Mishnah, which is the oral law, and the Gemara, which is the interpretation of the Mishnah. So the oral law, what they believe is that it was handed down to Moses at the same time as the written law when he was on the mountaintop receiving that. And they believe he passed it on to Joshua. Joshua passed it on to the prophets, and then the prophets, it later got passed on to the rabbis who transcribed it in the year 200 AD. Well, now if we think about, okay, this forced conversion of the Edomites and the Khazarians means there's further admixture within the Judeans. So now you have this question that raises, and that is, who are the true Israelites? Who are the true Jews? Like, who are the true children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And of course, this is a very contested question, very difficult to answer. But I want to present some things for us to consider as people search out the answer to this question. And it brings us back to C.F. Parker's book that I talked about earlier. Because what he suggests is in modern Jewry, there's two categories in modern Jewry, Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. Now, I'll talk more about Ashkenazi Jews because there's a connection to the Federal Reserve and to the Khazarians. So what C.F. Parker says and what he suggests is that there is Edomite influence among the Ashkenazi Jews. It might be minimal, but we can't overlook it. So he says this, the Ashkenazic Jewry is thus comprised of three elements of not exactly known proportions. So the first one is those of Judite descent, those of Idumean origin, or the Edomites, and those proselytes from other origins, which essentially he's talking about the Khazarians. So now there's this long-standing debate, but as to who are the Ashkenazi Jews? Where do they come from? And some scholars believe they come from the land of Germany. but there's
Rhine,
actually,
the Rhineland, wasn't it? Yeah, it's like
right,
yeah.
yes. But there's actually growing evidence that they can trace their roots back to Khazaria. So in the 12th century, there was a rabbi that recorded in his travel log that the kingdom of Khazaria actually comes from the descendants of Meshach, son of Gomer, grandson of Japheth, great-grandson of Noah. So I'll connect the dots for us. Now, this also was confirmed in a letter by one of the Khazarian kings, King Joseph. And he writes in that letter that the Khazars, their bloodline comes from Japheth, which is one of the three sons of Noah. Now, what's interesting is that this bloodline also produced Magog, Togarmah, and Ashkenaz. And so the Talmudic actually makes reference to a town near the Black Sea called Ashkenaz. Their bloodline comes from Japheth, which is one of the three sons of Noah. Now, what's interesting is that this bloodline also produced Magog, Togarmah, and Ashkenaz. And so the Talmudic actually makes reference to a town near the Black Sea called Ashkenaz. But it's not just that town. Ashkenaz was used as a term to broadly describe the Khazar kingdom. And so you get the Scythians also come from the bloodline of Magog and Ashkenaz. And there's an interesting clue in the book of Ezekiel that describes the trade practices of some of the descendants of Meshach and Togarmah. So I'll read that. This is verse 13 and 14 in Ezekiel 27. It says, Greece, Tubal, and Meshach did business with you, trading slaves and bronze for your products. Beth Togarmah traded workhorses, war horses, and mules for your products. Okay, so in this passage, what it's saying is that the ancestors of the Khazars were slave traders, so they were human traffickers, and they were warlike people that utilized horses in battle. Well, this actually gets confirmed by Matthew Johnson, that professor, one of our experts on Khazaria. He wrote an article or an essay. It's called The Regime, Usury, Khazaria, and the American Mass. And so in it, he gives us a really interesting window into the trade practices that shape the economic policies of the Khazar Empire. So I'll read an excerpt from it. He says, in Russian history, this usury was the role of Khazaria. Charging tolls on passing merchants was their primary form of income. Domestically, the top layer of society, mostly Jewish, extracted tribute from their conquered peoples. The Khazar Empire had a small but powerful group of Jewish bankers in Kiev as early as the 10th century. Khazaria existed as a multinational state ruled over by an oligarchy of Jewish converts. Few historians will touch this issue, and with good reason. By controlling the Great Silk Road, the Khazar Jews fully seized the trade between East and West, between North and South. That is, all the trade routes passing through the Caucasus Mountains. Well, this was the main purpose of their migration to the region. Full control of the caravan routes passing through the Khazar Khanate allowed the Jews to establish a trade monopoly, where they began to control the prices of imported and local goods. Well, as a result, consumers were gouged. He says, according to the testimony of medieval travelers, the main source of income of the Khazar Khanate, except for usury, was the slave trade. Regular raids on neighboring lands, mostly Slavic, gave Khazars a large number of slaves, which were sold all over the world. Trade in general, and the slave trade in particular, has always been the traditional source of income for Jewish entrepreneurs, and a source of super profits, which made it possible to get rich quick and further strengthen its parasitic power.
This has been Rabbinic Judaism, everything you need to know.